Have you ever sat across the dinner table from your grown child, looked into their eyes, and felt like something had quietly shifted, but you couldn't quite put your finger on it? Maybe the words are the same, maybe the gestures are polite, even warm, but there's a subtle distance, a silence between the lines, a missing warmth you used to feel so clearly. If you've ever felt that, you're not alone. As we grow older, the relationships we once poured our hearts into, especially with our children, can change in ways we never expected. And it can hurt. Not because of shouting matches or angry goodbyes, but because of something even harder to face: quiet withdrawal. This video is not about blaming anyone. It's not about making you feel like you've done something wrong. It's about recognizing the signs when love, particularly the love between you and your child, begins to drift. More importantly, it's about how to respond with clarity, with dignity, and with strength, guided by calm reflection and emotional insight. You see, love doesn't always leave loudly. Sometimes it fades like autumn leaves, slowly losing their color before falling to the ground. No one announces it. It just happens. And often, by the time we realize it, something essential has already gone missing. Let me tell you a story. There was a man named James, a father in his 70s. He had 2 adult children, both successful, both seemingly respectful and caring. They would visit on holidays, call once in a while, and always said the right things. But James, sitting in his quiet home after they left, felt something strange. It wasn't what they said, it was what they no longer said. It was how they stopped sharing the little details of their lives, how they stopped asking for advice, how their words felt edited, safe, detached. That's when he remembered something he had once read: "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Realize this, and you will find strength. James realized that what hurt wasn't so much their behavior, it was his own expectation that things would never change. That's why we're here today. Because whether you're like James or simply feeling a subtle change in your relationships, it matters that you understand what's happening and what it means. Not to overreact, not to blame, but to see clearly, to adjust with grace, and to protect your peace. Now let's talk about the first thing that usually happens when your child starts to lose that deep emotional connection with you. And again, this doesn't always come from anger. Often, it comes from something far more difficult to name: emotional drift. The first thing they do is this: they stop letting you into their inner world. You might still get the updates, what the grandkids are up to, where they're going on vacation, maybe even a casual, "How are you doing, Mom?" But the texture of the relationship starts to feel thin. They no longer share their struggles. They don't come to you for wisdom like they used to. The deep emotional honesty, the kind that makes you feel like an important part of their journey, starts to vanish. This isn't always out of cruelty. In fact, they may not even realize they're doing it. But to the one on the receiving end, you, it can feel like you're standing behind a door that used to be wide open and is now slowly closing without a sound. And it's painful. Because as a parent, especially after giving so much of your life to nurturing, guiding, and loving them, you expect to be part of their world forever. It doesn't feel fair to be locked out without a word. But here's where a deeper perspective becomes powerful. As one wise thinker once said, "We are not disturbed by things, but by the views we take of them." In other words, our pain often comes not from the event itself, but from what we believe it should be. So, what can you do when your child stops sharing their inner world with you? The answer isn't to pry. It's not to guilt them. It's to watch, to listen, and to accept without resentment. You can still be present, still offer your love, but you no longer chase the version of them that once needed you so deeply. James learned this the hard way. He tried everything, sending thoughtful texts, asking open-ended questions, even baking his daughter's favorite banana bread when she visited. But her responses were always short, kind, Yes, but careful. He realized one day, while sitting alone at the kitchen table, that he had been trying to force a connection that was no longer mutual. And that's when he stopped asking for stories she no longer wanted to tell. Not because he gave up, but because he began to respect his own peace. He started to fill his days with things that made him feel whole again. Books, walks, volunteering, learning something new, not waiting for someone else to make him feel included. Now, the second quiet shift is harder to catch, but just as important. When love begins to fade, the comparisons begin. Not out loud, not even intentionally, but subtly, silently. You might notice your child admiring other people, other lifestyles, other ideas, even other parents, with a tone that suggests something is missing in their own family. You may hear them say things like, "You know, Sarah's mom still travels everywhere with her," or "Brian's dad is so good with the kids." They won't say it directly, but you'll feel it. That sting of being quietly measured and found not enough. That happened to James too. One afternoon, he overheard his son mention how his friend's father had helped build a treehouse for the grandkids. James had never been handy with tools, and his heart sank. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. There was no, "Dad, I remember when you..." No warmth in the memory. Just a quiet preference for something James couldn't offer. But comparison is the thief of appreciation. And when someone starts comparing, it's often because they've stopped looking for reasons to be grateful. True self-worth means being content with who you truly are. In other words, your value doesn't diminish just because someone else stops recognizing it. You are not a lesser parent because your child sees qualities in others. You are still whole, still valuable, still you. The challenge is not to chase their attention or try to mold yourself into someone you're not. The challenge is to stand in your truth, to be who you are without apology. Because the moment you start competing for love, it stops being love. It becomes performance. And you are not here to perform. You are here to live. James, over time, began to understand this. He didn't try to become a handyman or a storyteller just to win affection. Instead, he stayed kind. He stayed present. But he also stayed grounded. He let his children walk their own paths, even if those paths wandered away from him. And in doing so, he reclaimed something even more important than being loved. He reclaimed his peace. So, if you've noticed your children pulling away, if they no longer share their thoughts with you, if they quietly compare you to others without saying a word, don't panic. Don't beg. Don't break yourself trying to earn what should be freely given. Instead, breathe. Watch. Reflect. And remember, you still have power over your mind, over your choices, and over how you carry yourself in this chapter of life. Because your worth didn't begin with their love, and it doesn't end with it either. James never raised his voice. Not once. He didn't lash out or accuse. That wasn't his way. But deep down, the silence was getting heavier. He could feel it, not just in the distance between his children and himself, but in the small spaces that used to be filled with warmth. A smile across the room. A casual, "Hey, Dad, remember when we..." That softness had gone, and what replaced it was stillness. Polite, clean, safe, but empty. He started to notice little things. The way his daughter always seemed distracted when they talked. How she spoke freely with friends on the phone, laughing about things she never shared with him. How his son brought the grandkids to visit, but always seemed in a rush, watching the clock, eager to get back to something or someone else. James was still part of their routine, but not their heart. And that was the hardest part. If you're watching this, maybe you felt it too. Maybe your calls are returned, but short. Maybe your birthday gets a text instead of a visit. Maybe they still say love you, but it feels like punctuation, not a real feeling. And you ask yourself, did I do something wrong? Am I no longer important? How did we get here? But here's something that helped James, and it might help you too. Just because love fades doesn't mean it never existed. Just because someone pulls away doesn't mean you failed them. Sometimes people change, life gets busy, hearts shift. It's not always personal, but that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. There's a powerful quote that says, "Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control." You see, James had to learn, not by choice, but by experience, that you can't force someone to let you back into their inner world. You can knock and knock, but if the door stays closed, all you're doing is exhausting yourself. So he stopped knocking, not out of bitterness, not because he gave up, but because he finally saw that holding on to someone who is emotionally slipping away can sometimes cost you the most valuable thing you have left: your peace. That's where so many of us struggle. We believe that love, especially from our children, is something permanent. That because we gave everything, our time, our youth, our strength, they owe us lifelong affection. And yes, perhaps in a perfect world that would be true. But people are human. They forget. They get lost in their own storms. They drift, not with bad intentions, but with full calendars and restless minds. And so the challenge becomes not how to bring them back, but how to hold on to yourself while they're gone. One day, after a particularly quiet visit from his daughter, James took a walk to the edge of his property. It was early autumn, and the trees had started changing color. He noticed one tree in particular, tall, old, proud, dropping its leaves slowly, one by one. And he thought to himself, even the strongest trees let go when it's time. Not because they want to, but because they know they must. That's when he realized something beautiful. Letting go isn't weakness. It's wisdom. It's trusting that life, just like the seasons, knows when something no longer serves us. The next morning, James wrote a short note to himself and left it on the kitchen table where he'd see it every day. "I can't control how they love me, but I can control how I love myself." That single sentence became his compass. From that moment forward, he decided to live not in waiting, but in choosing. He chose to focus on the parts of his life that brought him joy. Walking with his neighbor in the mornings, cooking a new recipe on Sundays, even starting a small garden out back just to see something grow again. And wouldn't you know it? Something unexpected happened. Without chasing, without begging, without asking. His daughter stayed longer the next visit. His son lingered after dinner instead of checking his watch. Slowly, carefully, something began to return. Not quite like before, but real nonetheless. Because love, when given space, sometimes finds its own way back. But James had already learned the most important truth. Even if it doesn't, he would be okay. And that's what I want you to hear today. You don't have to perform for anyone. You don't have to beg to be noticed or compare yourself to what other parents seem to have. You are enough. Right here. As you are. Maybe your children no longer come to you for comfort. Maybe they've stopped including you in decisions or asking for your opinion. And yes, that can make you feel invisible. But invisibility doesn't mean irrelevance. Your value doesn't disappear just because someone else can't or won't see it. We are guests in each other's lives, not owners, and that includes your children. We guide them, nurture them, love them deeply, but we don't possess them. At some point, we have to let go of the idea that they owe us a version of themselves that fits our memories. Now, some of you might be thinking, but shouldn't I fight for my relationship with my children? Shouldn't I say something before it's too late? And to that I say, speak honestly, but speak without desperation. Tell them you miss the connection. Tell them you're always here. But don't tie your happiness to whether or not they respond. Because when love is healthy, it doesn't need to be chased. It meets you where you are. So if you're standing in that quiet place, wondering whether your child still loves you, look not for the loud signs. Look for the quiet ones. Are they still letting you in? Or has the garden gate closed? Are they sharing their lives or giving you the edited version? Are they still seeing you with eyes of love or through a lens of comparison? It's okay to grieve the closeness that once was. That grief is real. But don't let it harden you. Let it shape you. Let it teach you how to find peace, even when relationships change form. James still misses the old days, but he no longer aches for them. He found peace in what he could control, his actions, his thoughts, his own heart. So can you. If you've felt unseen lately, if you've been holding on to a version of love that no longer returns your calls, let this be your reminder. Your life isn't over just because someone stopped choosing you. You can choose yourself. You can choose to keep growing, keep giving, keep shining, even if the audience looks different now. Because your worth didn't retire at 60 or vanish when the kids moved out. It's still here, still burning, still beautiful. And maybe, just maybe, when you stop chasing love, you start finding something even deeper: peace, purpose, and the power to live on your own terms. The days grew shorter, and James continued his quiet routines. He still made tea in the mornings. He still read the same worn books in his favorite chair by the window. But there was something different in the way he moved through life now. He wasn't waiting anymore. Not for a phone call. Not for a visit. Not for a moment that used to mean everything to him. He had begun, slowly and quietly, to make peace with what was. And in doing so, he found something most of us forget when love starts to shift: freedom. There's a certain power that comes from no longer trying to fix things that don't want fixing. From realizing that love isn't something you earn by being perfect, it's something others give freely, or not at all. And when they stop giving it, you have every right to stop waiting for it. Now that doesn't mean closing your heart. Not at all. In fact, James kept his heart open, but he stopped tying his sense of self to whether or not someone walked through the door. Because the truth is, when we keep knocking on a closed door, we miss all the other ones quietly opening around us. The neighbor who waves a little longer each morning. The grandchild who lights up when you really listen to their stories. The joy of rediscovering yourself in new hobbies, new friendships, or even just in a peaceful walk through the park. That's what true strength looks like. Not the absence of emotion, but the presence of calm in the face of change. It's the kind of strength that says, I still love, but I won't beg. I still care, but I won't crumble. I still remember, but I won't stay stuck. James knew he couldn't undo the slow drift that had taken place between him and his children. But he also realized something else, something that changed everything. He could choose not to lose himself in the process. He could still greet them with kindness when they came. He could still answer their calls with warmth, even if they were rare. But he no longer built his days around them. He no longer checked the calendar hoping for invitations that never came. Instead, he planted his life firmly in the present. And from that present, he began to grow again. Maybe that's something you've been needing to hear. Maybe today is your reminder that your best days aren't behind you. Not because life hasn't changed, but because you haven't stopped living. It's easy to think that if our children don't show love the way they used to, we've somehow failed. But that's not the full picture. Relationships evolve. Priorities shift. Sometimes our children are battling things they haven't told us about. Sometimes in their effort to protect their own space, they create a distance they don't even notice. But you notice. Of course you do. Because love, when it's real, notices absence more than presence. It feels the silence. It aches in the gaps. Still, there's a profound truth to remember. What is not within our control must not be allowed to disturb our peace. James started writing again. Nothing big, just small reflections at the end of the day. What he saw, what he felt, what he hoped for, not from others, but from himself. He wrote about resilience, about how even the loneliest trees still reach toward the sun. He wrote about forgiveness, not just for others, but for himself. For all the times he held on too tightly. For all the moments he gave more than he received. And for how long it took him to understand that letting go is not a betrayal of love, but sometimes its highest form. Because love that demands nothing is the purest kind of all. And it was in those quiet moments, just him, his pen, and the rhythm of life outside his window, that James rediscovered something sacred, the joy of simply being alive. You see, the greatest danger when our children drift away isn't that we lose them. It's that we begin to lose ourselves in the process. We stop doing the things we love. We stop exploring new experiences. We shrink our world down to the size of their absence. But what if instead we expanded it? What if we took the time we once spent waiting and used it to create, to give, to grow? What if we allowed ourselves to feel the pain of distance, but didn't let it define our days? James joined a local storytelling circle at the library. He didn't talk much at first. He just listened. But over time he began to share small pieces of his journey, of his joys and disappointments. And to his surprise, people listened. Really listened. That's the beauty of aging with grace. You realize that you still have something to say, something to offer, that your voice didn't fade just because someone else stopped hearing it. So, if you're sitting with a heavy heart today, wondering how to bridge the distance between you and your children, remember this: love is not just a feeling. It's a way of being. And the most powerful kind of love you can show, especially now, is the love you give yourself. Take care of your body. Nurture your mind. Feed your spirit. Do not put your soul on pause for the sake of someone else's absence. Because the one thing you must never lose in the effort to keep someone else's love is your own. There's a quiet revolution that happens when you stop asking, "Why don't they see me?" and start asking, "What do I see in this day, this breath, this life?" That shift, however small, is the beginning of healing. James didn't get everything back. His children didn't suddenly become who they once were. But that was okay, because he had changed too. He no longer needed them to prove their love in order to feel worthy of love itself. And in that transformation, he found the one thing he never knew he needed: peace, not from the world around him, but from within. So here's what I'll leave you with today. You may not have control over how others love you, but you always have control over how you choose to respond. You can choose dignity. You can choose stillness. You can choose to live, not in the shadow of someone else's affection, but in the light of your own presence. Your value has not gone anywhere. Your life still holds meaning. Your story isn't over. It's still being written. And maybe, just maybe, this new chapter will be the most honest one yet. Not because it's full of people, but because it's full of you. You've made it this far. You've given your love generously. Now give some of it back to yourself, because you are still here. And that, my friend, is more than enough.